Hey everyone, this is lecture 6.2, Deviance and Crime. This one is going to be relatively brief, but it is important. So we're talking about when deviance becomes crime, because not all deviance is criminal. And then we're going to talk about some of the ways that societies treat people who have committed acts of criminal deviance. So, in the United States, serious crimes are punished by imprisonment. That's how we that's how we deal with crime in the United States. However, other cultures have punished people in different ways, and both shunning and banishment are only really punishments that are possible in a pre-modern society. So, what shunning is the act of ignoring somebody, of completely ignoring somebody, refusing to interact with that person. If you are living in a very small town that is very physically isolated from other parts of society, this can have a very dangerous effect. So if somebody does something very bad, everyone in that community then agrees to not interact with that person. And that could be intensely detrimental. So let's say you get sick, the doctor won't see you. If you need to buy something, nobody will sell anything to you. You are on your own. You have to grow all your own stuff. You have to make all your own stuff. And while in some of these societies that is possible for someone to be self-sustaining in that way, it makes things very, very difficult. If your house catches on fire, then no one will help you put it out. So this could be quite dangerous. Banishment then is one step further than shunning, in which the individual is not only completely ignored, they are forced to leave entirely. So effectively, the person or the family is forced to basically walk off into the woods and potentially die, right? Now, given that doesn't necessarily mean a death sentence, maybe depending on the society, you're allowed to take your stuff with you and move away. And maybe if you're able to get through that very hard, traumatizing time of building a new homestead or something like that, then you can survive a mediumly okay life. But it's still quite a trauma, quite a punishment. And then corporal punishments. Corporal punishments are not unheard of in the modern world, but they are less common. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a spot. So with both shunning and banishment, the reason those don't really exist anymore is because in most societies, if people are shunning you or if you're banished from a settlement, you can just go somewhere else, right? So that wouldn't work in a place like the United States because you could just move away, right? Or you could, even if it's as bad as being in a state or a country, which it doesn't really apply to this, you can just go somewhere else. Okay, anyway, back to corporal punishment. This is physically harming an individual's body as a form of punishment. So this could be something like whipping. This can be something like mutilating a person, chopping off a hand, things like acid attacks that happen in some parts of the world. Those are a form of corporal punishment. There is a slight, maybe tendency, maybe misunderstanding in the United States that could make us think, well, maybe that's not that bad, right? Maybe I would rather, instead of serving 10 years in prison, I would let someone chop 2 fingers off my hand if it meant I wouldn't have to go to prison, right? Or maybe even my whole hand. Maybe I would be willing to have my left hand cut off because I'm right-handed instead of going to prison for 10 years. And that is maybe something that we could even think about as a society, but then you have to take other elements into consideration there. Corporal punishment in these ways, in societies where it exists, is very rarely clinical and very rarely formal, right? So corporal punishment is done to other people in kind of a vigilante sort of way. So people who are victims of acid attacks, are attacked by somebody else in the community who have felt that that person has done something as a violation of the norms and standards of their societies. We see this most commonly in areas with acid attacks, actually, where women are very deeply oppressed and they have done something to violate the norms of those societies. And often, and most typically, those so-called violations are things that those of us being in the United States would not consider to be any kind of crime. Corporal punishment may sound like something that could be something a society would do, but the reality of the matter is that it has its very ugly elements. And I'll talk about prison in a couple slides. The next point I want to touch on is that crimes and punishments change over time. One thing I like to stress and re-stress in this course is that culture shifts not only based on place, not only is our culture in the United States different than the culture in Japan or France or Canada or Belgium, but our culture today is different than the culture of our great-great-grandparents, different than the culture of our parents, and will be different than the culture of our grandchildren, right? So what is against the law, what is not against the law changes with time. That first picture is at one time period completely enforcing the law and another period completely against the law. That is an image of federal agents dumping out alcohol during the Prohibition era. During Prohibition, it was illegal to possess and produce alcohol, most alcohol in the United States. So during that era of Prohibition, then that would have been an enforcement of the law. However, in the time before Prohibition and the time after Prohibition, which now is still after Prohibition, now that alcohol is fully legal, that first image would be an image of destruction of a private citizen's property, right? So that's an example. Our second image is a picture of legal over-the-counter heroin. Heroin was actually first synthesized by the Bayer Corporation, the same Bayer that makes low-dose aspirin that many people take to minimize their risk of heart attack, right? That same Bayer. And the Bayer Corporation originally synthesized heroin from poppy seeds, and heroin was actually a brand name originally. And they synthesized it to make a less addictive form of morphine, is where heroin originally comes from. And obviously they screwed that one up really bad. But during the era of this bottle of heroin, it was entirely legal for your average citizen, even without a prescription, to go into a pharmacy and purchase this product. Really very interesting indeed. So let's talk a little bit about controls and punishments as they exist in the United States. So there are four types of control there are four justifications, it should say, for social control. And so these are four justifications for prisons and other forms of punishment. And when we consider these and how this plays out in our prison system, it really illustrates a lot of elements of the American prison system without going into too great of detail. So these four reasons are deterrence, retribution, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. From the deterrence standpoint, we put people in prison to threaten those people who might consider committing crime with harsh penalties. From this standpoint, then, you need to make something like murder against the law to keep people from murdering. That's the idea there. Retribution, then, is the idea of revenge for a crime that has been committed. So we put people in prison to punish them, to sometimes this comes up in our language in the criminal justice system, seeking justice for the victims or families, right? And with retribution, especially considering the belief structures of many people in the United States, we like to pretend that we are not people who seek revenge, who don't want to, don't seek out that kind of punishment of getting even, right? But we absolutely see that in some elements of the criminal justice system, that's very much there. And getting justice for the victims' families. Retribution might not necessarily be involved in conversations surrounding shoplifting, but absolutely when you look at certain crimes like rapists and serial killers and stuff like that, then we do start to talk about those things again. Incapacitation, then. These are crimes that are, this is a justification for prison that involves removing criminals from society by imprisoning them. This tells us two elements here. That, and this is absolutely one, deterrence, retribution, incapacitation, these are absolutely present in the American prison system, right? And then with incapacitation, we take criminals out of the general population and put them in prison so that they can't commit that crime anymore. And if we don't think about it, that makes perfect sense. Yes, that's why we put people in prison. But then you pull back a layer and you say, wait a minute, if we put a murderer in prison, if we put a rapist in prison, yeah, they aren't able to murder or rape people outside of the prison, but they certainly are capable of murdering and raping people inside the prison, right? What does that tell us? That we have an assumption that people who are in prison do not deserve to be, well, no, so let me restate that. We have an assumption that people who are in prison deserve to be murdered and raped because of this incapacitation mindset. We're simply not concerned what happens to people when they are in prison. And that's a very disturbing concept once we identify it. It's deeply, deeply problematic. And then our fourth rationale for social control is rehabilitation. That we put people in prisons, that we dole out criminal justice to fix people so that they can re-enter society. Now, unfortunately, this justification for prisons and other forms of social control in the United States is often given in the stated function of a prison, or maybe in certain criminal justice programs. But the reality of the matter is that when we compare the United States to other similar countries, we do a very, very bad job of fixing our people, our people who are put in prison, and making them able to make better choices in the future. As a matter of fact, and that's tied in with a concept called recidivism. The recidivism rate is the rate at which people who are released from prison go on then to commit further crimes in the future. The recidivism rate of most classifications of criminals in the United States are quite high. Yeah, okay, so moving on. In this slide, we see, and these are just some raw statistics. I'll talk it through. If we were doing this in person, I would ask you to give me some observations. We see prisoners per 10,000 residents in countries. We also see the percentage of females in the prison system in those countries, the prisoners under 18 in those countries, and let me just talk through some of these numbers. So, for example, I'm just going to mention a few of these just so you understand what we're looking at. In Brazil, there are 25.3 people in prison per 10,000 residents. There are 7.4% of those people in prison are female, and 0% are under 18. In Mexico, then, we have 20 people per 10,000 residents in prison. 4.5% of that are female, and under 18 are under 14%. And then in the United States, we have 74.3 people per 10,000 in prison, 8.8% of that being female, and under 18 being 0.4%. There are many observations you could make about this table. Let me point out a few of them. Observe that in Brazil, 0% of people under 18 are in prison. That is because, by virtue of the law in Brazil, people who are under 18 cannot be put in prison. Additionally, let's see. You'll observe in India that 3.2 people per 10,000 people are in prison. Now that makes it look like that there is actually a very low population in Indian prisons. The reality of the matter is that Indian prisons are actually greatly overcrowded, and there is not enough prison space to match the proportionality of the population. So that's kind of a weird outlier statistic there. Russia is known as being a country with a very high prison population, 56.8, but you will notice that that is far lower than the United States. We do have the highest proportion, the highest prison population per proportion of the population of anywhere in the world. You will also observe that in Russia and in the United States, there are a similar female to male ratio, about just under 9% of that prison population. It is absolutely true that there are far fewer women in prison than there are men in prison. That is a complex matter of gender dynamics, actually. A significant component of that is that we do encourage men in our society by what we consider to be masculine behaviors, such as fighting and doing dangerous things. And then we encourage more men to do those things that could land them in prison, for sure. Additionally, you can look into the traditions in the United States of what we punish men for and what we punish women for. If you look back into the early 20th century and even into the 1800s, you will see that those quote-unquote crimes that women did in those eras were things that women were punished for in the household or within families, while those crimes that men did in that era were things that were doled out by the criminal justice system. And that absolutely is very wildly old-fashioned, but the tendencies of the criminal justice system were established in the late 1800s. So a lot of that carries over there. You will also observe that the United States actually has a relatively low portion of its prison system under 18. That is because we do have a substantial juvenile justice system in the United States to talk something good about the American criminal justice system. We do tend to be much better at least attempting to rehabilitate young people as compared to our adult criminal justice system. Now, if you know anyone that when they were younger did get in trouble with the juvenile justice system, it is also profoundly broken, but it's a little less broken than the adult system is. One last thing, you observe Mexico has an under 18 population of 14%. of those in prison. That is because they do not have a separate a separate juvenile justice system. So if you break the law in Mexico and you're under 18, you just go into adult prison. So this slide illustrates both a very good chart and a very bad chart. The top chart is very good at illustrating the major problem with the prison system in the United States, in that 38.2% of the population of American prisons is black, while only 12% of the American population is black. This points to a massive systemic racism problem in our criminal justice system. If we did not have that issue of systemic racism, then we would expect that about 65% of the white prison population would be white, about 12% would be black, and about 16% would be Latinx or Hispanic. That is not what we see here. We see a far more black people in prison than are in the general population. That's one element there. You may observe that we have 16% of the Latinx population in the general U.S. population, 20% in the prison system. In terms of kind of messy statistics, that might be within the realm of statistical significance. So my guess, looking at those percentages, is that maybe there is some racial injustice happening there surrounding the Hispanic population, but we see a much greater, much stronger, much more dangerous effect happening to the black population here. And as soon as you reject the racist assumption that, well, black people are more prone to committing crime than white people, as soon as you reject that resoundingly untrue element, then you see just a very disturbing trend. And then that lower chart really is terrible. It's not that great. So the guns represent violent offenses. The hats, as in burglars, represent property offenses. There are those there that are drug offenses, and then disorderly conduct. The problem with this chart is that it's trying to break things into hundreds percent, right? So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 drunken public disorder jail offenses there. The reality of the matter is that many crimes are combinations, right? So if someone's breaking into a house, they probably have a gun on them. And if someone's breaking in a house, they may in all likelihood be high on an illegal drug. So there are definitely combination factors there. Another problem with this chart is that while the upper chart is really good, this slide confuses or muddles the difference between prisons and jails, and I'd like to mention that right now. Prisons are long-term holding facilities. That is where you do your time after you have been convicted of a crime. A jail is supposed to be a short-term holding facility, and in most parts of the country it is illegal, or at least not good, and your attorneys can file if you're held there, in many areas greater than a year. Some places it's 2 years, but you're not supposed to be in prison for a prolonged period of time. You start to come up against a violation of your right to a speedy trial once you're in prison for more than 12 months. So, last topic I want to cover in this lecture is the idea of a moral panic. A moral panic is a phenomena in which society becomes very concerned over something that is later revealed to be an overreaction. And we see moral panics passing ebbing and flowing in our society. And this is, again, very much something that, at least in terms of modern society, occurs over and over and over again. Two examples from the 20th century. In the 1950s, there was a trend toward horror comics, right? So this was like things with like skeletons chasing after people and maybe devils with pitchforks. Very, by modern standards, what we would consider very corny themes. And I've read a lot of these because this is a kind of comic that I really enjoy. But the themes in there, not only are they by modern standards kind of silly, but and not scary, but also most of them are actually like little morality stories, as if like, well, if you're a criminal, eventually a ghost is going to come and kill you, or something like that. So they're actually kind of wholesome, which is something I find intriguing about horror comics of this era. But during that era, people were convinced that children were going to become like murderers and corrupt and deranged because they were reading these horror comics. And then those kids that grew up, those wound up being the baby boomers, right? And we did not see a dramatic uptick in that generation of being horribly deranged individuals. With that said, we did see a dramatic uptick in serial killers in the 1970s, and those people, yes, they were baby boomers, but the research does not indicate that that was tied to horror comics. It was actually, there's pretty reasonable evidence that that was actually tied to pollution that was in the air and increased and better policing tactics, actually. Nothing to do with horror comics. NWA and the phenomena of gangster rap in the mid-1990s triggered another moral panic one generation later. These young people are the people that are currently, they're not young anymore, currently classified as Generation X, people about 10 years older than me. So in this era then, in the 1990s, people were convinced, again, that some media that young people were consuming was going to make those youth corrupt and deranged and super psycho killers, right? Basically was the idea. Well, that simply didn't happen, right? Ice Cube, for example, is now a kids movie star. Dr. Dre is now a successful headphones mogul, right? And NWA is really a classic of like mid-90s music, quite frankly. But people were very concerned about that. And it wound up being really nothing to be concerned about. Now, these are both two relatively simple concerns. There are then sometimes moral panics that are tied in and a little bit more complex. Maybe there is something to be concerned with, but then society becomes way too overreactionary, even though there might be a piece of a problem there. Most of those can also be classified as moral panics then, but I do believe I have talked enough for this lecture. So I will be done right there. And if you have any other questions, just send me an email. Bye.